In January 2026, the most powerful warship on Earth was crippled without a single shot being fired. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a nuclear-powered supercarrier carrying 90 aircraft and 5,000 personnel, suddenly didn't know where it was. Its navigation systems reported the ship was 600 kilometers inland. In Iran, on land, obviously impossible, but the systems believed it. Pilots preparing for launch couldn't get accurate coordinates. Weapons targeting systems drifted out of sync. Encrypted communications became unreliable, and across the northern Arabian Sea, every GPS-dependent system on the carrier strike group began failing simultaneously. If you're fascinated by the invisible wars reshaping modern power, subscribe to A Disturbed Historian. We're covering the conflicts fought in frequencies you can't see, but that control everything. This wasn't a malfunction. It was an attack. For 72 hours, Iran subjected the Abraham Lincoln to the most sophisticated electronic warfare operation ever conducted against an American carrier. They used Russian-made Murmansk BN systems, massive electronic warfare platforms, designed specifically to blind GPS and disrupt satellite communications. And they worked. A $400 million jamming system reduced a $25 billion carrier strike group to 60% operational capability without firing a missile, without risking a pilot, without giving the United States a clear target to retaliate against. The attack didn't start on January 26th when the jamming began. It started weeks earlier with preparation that nobody noticed until it was too late. Iranian drones, small surveillance models that looked like commercial aircraft on radar, flew patterns around the carrier strike group. They weren't attacking, they were mapping, recording every electronic emission, every radar frequency, every communication channel, every GPS receiver. They built a complete electronic signature of the carrier group. And then they used that signature to design a jamming operation, targeting the specific frequencies and systems the Lincoln relied on. GPS is invisible infrastructure. We think of it as free, reliable, always available. Your phone uses it. Your car uses it. Every ship, every aircraft, every modern weapons system uses it. But GPS is just radio signals from satellites. Very weak radio signals, so weak that they're easy to jam if you know what you're doing. And Iran knew exactly what they were doing. The Murmansk BN systems they deployed can jam GPS across hundreds of kilometers. They can disrupt satellite communications. They can create false signals that make receivers think they're somewhere they're not. When the jamming started, the immediate effects were chaotic. Ship navigation systems began showing impossible positions. The carrier's coordinates jumped erratically across the map. At one point, the system reported the Lincoln was 600 kilometers away, on land inside Iran. The crew knew this was false. Obviously. You can look out the window and see you're at sea. But the navigation systems couldn't be trusted. And when you can't trust your navigation, everything breaks down. Flight operations depend on precise positioning. Pilots need to know exactly where the carrier is to return and land. Aircraft need GPS for navigation and weapons targeting. Without reliable GPS, flight operations become exponentially more dangerous. The Lincoln reduced flight operations by 40%. Pilots who did fly had to perform manual landings without GPS guidance, approaching a carrier deck at night in rough seas without electronic assistance is one of the most dangerous things a pilot can do. Several near misses occurred. Pure skill and luck prevented crashes. Communication encryption on modern military systems uses GPS timestamps. The sender and receiver systems need to be synchronized to the same time, accurate to fractions of a second. GPS provides that synchronization. When GPS fails, the clocks drift out of sync. This is called temporal desynchronization. And when your clocks don't match, encrypted communications fail. Messages become garbled. Systems can't verify authenticity. The entire secure communication network degrades. Weapons targeting suffered similarly. Tomahawk cruise missiles use GPS for navigation. Precision-guided munitions rely on GPS coordinates. Even the carrier's defensive systems use GPS timestamps to coordinate responses. Without reliable GPS, the carrier's offensive capability dropped significantly. They could still fight, but with reduced accuracy and effectiveness. The most technologically advanced warship in the world was operating like it was the 1980s. The crew adapted. They had to. The Navy trains for GPS denial, though most sailors had never experienced it in real operations. They reverted to inertial navigation systems, which use gyroscopes and accelerometers to track movement from a known starting position. These systems drift over time, accumulating errors, but they work without external signals. They pulled out sextants and started using celestial navigation, measuring angles to stars to determine position. Techniques that hadn't been primary navigation methods in decades suddenly became critical. The carrier also implemented River City protocols, communication lockdowns designed to prevent electronic emissions that enemies can track or jam. Non-essential systems were shut down. Radio silence was enforced, except for critical communications. The strike group tried to minimize its electronic signature, make itself harder to target. But you can't make a carrier invisible. It's a floating city. It generates enormous heat signatures. It displaces water in ways that satellites can detect. You can reduce emissions, but you can't disappear. The jamming didn't just affect the military. It expanded across the Strait of Hormuz, the 33-kilometer-wide choke point where a third of the world's seaborne oil passes. Over 900 commercial vessels transiting the area lost GPS. Most modern ships rely entirely on GPS for navigation. Captains who'd never used traditional navigation techniques suddenly had to. Many didn't know how. Ships slowed to minimal speed. Some stopped entirely, afraid to navigate the crowded strait without reliable positioning. On January 28th, two oil tankers collided in the strait, the MV Horizon Star and MV Pacific Dawn. Both massive vessels carrying millions of barrels of crude oil struck each other in conditions that should have been easily navigable with GPS. Without it, in heavy traffic with systems they didn't trust, the captains miscalculated. The collision didn't cause a spill, but it could have. The potential for environmental and economic catastrophe was enormous, and it demonstrated that Iran's jamming wasn't just a military operation. It was economic warfare. Insurance companies immediately increased premiums for ships transiting the Gulf. Marine insurance rates jumped 12%. That cost gets passed through the supply chain. It becomes a tax on every barrel of oil, every container of goods moving through the region. Iran had effectively imposed a global economic penalty without firing a shot. They proved they could make the Strait of Hormuz unusable whenever they wanted, not by mining it or attacking ships, but by simply turning on jamming systems. The U.S. military's response initially focused on finding and destroying the jamming source. But the Murmansk BN systems are mobile. They operate from trucks. They can jam for hours, then relocate before anyone can target them. And they were operating from Iranian territory. Attacking them would require strikes inside Iran, which would be an act of war. The jamming was technically an act of war too, but it was deniable. Iran could claim they were just conducting defensive electronic warfare exercises. The U.S. couldn't prove hostile intent without admitting their systems had been compromised. So instead of attacking the source, the Navy focused on adapting. They needed a way to navigate and communicate that didn't depend on GPS. Traditional backup systems weren't enough for modern operations. Celestial navigation works, but it's slow and imprecise. Inertial systems drift. The carrier needed something better, and that's when SpaceX got involved. Elon Musk's engineers were already supporting Ukraine's military with Starlink Satellite internet terminals. Those terminals don't use GPS for positioning. They use a different technique called multilateration. By measuring signal timing from multiple Starlink satellites simultaneously, the terminals can calculate position without relying on GPS satellites. The technique is harder to jam because Starlink uses thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, communicating on different frequencies than GPS with more powerful signals. SpaceX engineers worked with the Navy to rapidly integrate Starlink terminals onto the Abraham Lincoln and its escort ships. This wasn't planned. The systems weren't designed for military use, but they worked. Within hours of installation, the carrier had reliable positioning again. Not through GPS, but through Starlink's constellation. The Iranians were still jamming GPS, but it didn't matter anymore. The carrier had bypassed their entire attack with commercial satellite internet technology. The Navy also implemented new communication protocols using Starlink's network. Encrypted military communications routed through. Starlink terminals weren't affected by the GPS jamming. Flight operations resumed. Weapon systems recalibrated using Starlink positioning. Within a day of integrating the new systems, the carrier was back to near full operational capability. The electronic warfare attack that had crippled the strike group for days was suddenly ineffective. Iran noticed. Their intelligence monitored the carrier's electronic emissions. They saw flight operations resume, saw coordination improve, realized the jamming was no longer working. On January 31st, 72 hours after it began, the jamming stopped. Iran had made their point. They'd demonstrated capability, proved they could blind American carrier groups, showed that GPS dependence was a critical vulnerability, and they'd done it without escalating to kinetic warfare, without giving the US clear justification for military retaliation. The incident reshaped strategic calculations across the region. Saudi Arabia accelerated plans for oil pipelines that bypassed the Strait of Hormuz entirely. If Iran can make the strait unusable through jamming, then alternative export routes become national security priorities. The United Arab Emirates increased investment in similar infrastructure. Both countries recognize that their economies are hostage to a choke point that Iran can close electronically. Israel and the United States ramped up development of jam-resistant systems, GPS-independent navigation, communication networks that don't rely on satellite timing, weapons that can operate in contested electromagnetic environments. The US military had assumed GPS would always be available. Iran proved that assumption was dangerously wrong. Every weapon system, every platform, every operational plan that depends on GPS now needs alternatives. The economic impacts extended globally. That 12% increase in marine insurance for the Gulf region translated to billions in additional costs. Energy prices spiked. Countries dependent on Gulf oil started diversifying suppliers and routes. The jamming lasted only 3 days, but its effects on global trade patterns will last years. Iran demonstrated asymmetric power. A $400 million investment in electronic warfare systems had strategic impact far beyond its cost. This wasn't traditional warfare. Nobody died. No shots were fired. No territory changed hands. But it was absolutely an act of war. Iran attacked the most powerful military asset the United States has in the region and reduced its capability by 40%. They did it in a way that was technically deniable, difficult to retaliate against, and strategically brilliant. And they proved a point that terrifies military planners. The age of uncontested GPS is over. Modern militaries have what strategists call critical non-kinetic dependencies, systems that don't involve weapons, but that weapons depend on. GPS is the most obvious. Satellite communications, undersea internet cables, power grids, all of these are vulnerable. All can be attacked in ways that cripple military capability. without triggering traditional warfare responses. The Abraham Lincoln incident was a demonstration. Iran showing the US and the world that they understand these vulnerabilities and can exploit them. The carrier strike group adapted. Starlink provided a workaround, but that workaround itself created new dependencies. Now the US military relies on a commercial satellite network owned by a private company. What happens if that network is jammed? What if SpaceX becomes a target? What if political pressure forces the company to restrict military use? Trading one dependency for another doesn't eliminate vulnerability. It just changes the attack surface. The deeper lesson is that complexity creates fragility. Modern military systems are incredibly sophisticated. They can do things that were impossible a generation ago, but they depend on invisible infrastructure that most people don't think about. GPS, satellites, fiber optic networks. When that infrastructure is attacked, the sophisticated systems fail. The most advanced technology becomes a liability. Iran didn't win a military victory in January 2026. The carrier strike group is still operating. US forces still dominate the region conventionally. But Iran won a strategic victory. They demonstrated that American military power, for all its technological superiority, has critical vulnerabilities. They showed that you don't need to sink a carrier to neutralize it. You just need to jam the invisible signals it depends on. And they did it in a way that doesn't give the US clear escalation options. What's the proportional response to electronic jamming? Bombing the jamming sites would be a kinetic strike inside Iran, a major escalation. Cyber attacks are possible but deniable and hard to prove. Economic sanctions are already extensive. Iran played in a gray zone where traditional military responses don't fit neatly. The 72-hour jamming operation was deterrence theater. Iran showing capability without escalating to shooting war, proving they have options beyond missiles and drones, demonstrating that they can contest American dominance in ways the US isn't fully prepared for, and forcing every military planner to reconsider assumptions about GPS, satellite communications, and the infrastructure modern warfare depends on. The Abraham Lincoln survived the attack, adapted, overcame, but the vulnerability remains. GPS is still jammable. Satellite communications are still disruptible. The infrastructure is still fragile, and now everyone knows it. Iran knows it. China knows it. Russia knows it. Every potential adversary of the United States just watched a relatively cheap electronic warfare system cripple the most powerful warship on Earth for 3 days. That knowledge changes everything. Future conflicts will start with electronic warfare. Jamming GPS, disrupting communications, attacking the invisible networks that modern militaries can't function without. The next time a carrier crosses a red line, the response might not be missiles. It might be jamming that blinds the carrier, leaves it operating at reduced capability, vulnerable to attacks it can't see coming. The era of treating GPS as reliable infrastructure is over. The era of assuming American technological superiority equals battlefield dominance is over. The era of invisible warfare, where the deadliest attacks happen in electromagnetic spectrum most people can't perceive. That era has arrived, and the USS Abraham Lincoln's 72 hours of blindness was just the opening demonstration. A warning about the wars to come, fought in frequencies we can't see, against infrastructure we depend on, in ways traditional military power struggles to counter. Iran proved their point. GPS can be jammed, carriers can be blinded. American power projection has vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited at relatively low cost with relatively low risk. That's the new strategic reality. Not tanks or missiles or aircraft, but the ability to turn off the invisible systems that make modern warfare possible. And nobody has a perfect solution. Just workarounds, adaptations, temporary fixes to fundamental dependencies that can't be eliminated. The jamming stopped, but the threat remains. The next crisis won't start from zero. It'll start from this demonstrated capability. From both sides knowing exactly what Iran can do to American carriers. From that knowledge shaping decisions about where ships patrol, how they operate, what risks are acceptable. The invisible war has been fought, and the side that was supposed to be invincible learned they're not. Not when the battlefield is electromagnetic spectrum, not when the weapons are jammers instead of missiles, not when the target is infrastructure instead of hardware. That's the lesson of January 2026. Power isn't just about who has the biggest weapons. It's about who controls the invisible networks those weapons depend on. And for 72 hours in the Arabian Sea, Iran controlled those networks, demonstrated that control, and changed the strategic calculation for every conflict that follows.